interested in the so the sublime is very much part of modernism, and I think that when he says that he started looking at art, and from the standpoint of eternity, like pushing the work in a way toward eternity, I think it's a push towards sublimity, and that makes him in some ways very much a part of his time, very much a man of his time. And that kind of relates also to Jacques Maritain, because you mentioned Maritain and the encounter, the Catholic encounter with modernism, both in theological terms and also in aesthetic terms. So that's one of the things that I was thinking this morning before our session. And contrasting it with St. Porphyrius, for instance, who is so much focused on the world and the presence of Christ in the midst of things as this kind of incarnational, like sensibility, if you wish, right? And his love of nature and his love of everything and his fascination with science, whereas St. Sophrony has a stronger sense of sublimity, like of the absence of God in a way through art. So that's just one thought.
That's a great place to start, I think.
Yeah, that's a great thought.
Yeah. So I'll kind of post hoc introduce you both really quickly, and I already started recording, so we can sort of go from there. Dr. Cornelia Tsakiridou teaches philosophy in the School of Arts and Sciences at Laselle University and is the author of multiple books, including the seminal Icons in Time, Persons in Eternity, and a multitude of articles related to aesthetics, theology, and political philosophy. Dr. Timothy Patitsas is the former interim dean of Hellenic College, assistant professor of ethics at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Seminary, author of the book The Ethics of Beauty, and co-founder of Beauty First Films. So thank you again, both of you. And yeah, we could return to what you were just talking about if the both of you would like. I think it's a very fecund topic. Perhaps in that regard, there's a quote that I mined from one of your articles. I think this is from your article on photography and icons. Take the aesthetic impact of the incarnation, the renewal of creation in Christ. In a world where matter is sanctified and divine grace enhances the actualizing reasons or logi of things, all media are in principle capable of spiritual subsistence, even those like photography and cinema that may seem inappropriate or unfit from the standpoint of set iconographic norms. That's only tacitly related in the sense that there's kind of an incarnational emphasis there.
Yeah, and it seems to be in some ways very Greek, that kind of involvement with the world, that engagement of beings. It is embedded in Greek language. Greek language is very descriptive. Martin Heidegger knew that. It taps not only into things as objects, but into things as activities. And that sense of being in the world as the world manifests itself is something that all the arts engage. Now, in postmodernist context, it may be that we're more interested in signification rather than in the being of things, right? But in how things are signified and how signification is construed. But if we follow Greek language, which is what Heidegger did in some ways, we understand why, like the saints, for instance, when they, they have a theotic experience, right, in prayer, in hesychasm, they return and delight in the world. And we have, a lot of testimony to that effect, right? So someone like St. Porphyrius, for instance, delights in the world. The arts delight in the world. And you can see that in Tarkovsky, for instance, right? The Russian director, and his beautiful film, Andrei Rublev. So I think all the arts can partake of the mystery of the incarnation. That they have not done it yet, or they have not done it enough, or a few people here and there have done it, that's a cultural thing. But potentially the arts have that grace in them, that potential. So that's a very open area, right? For us to think about how you can bring arts that seem so secular, like photography and cinema, into Christian life. And I don't mean it ideologically, like you make a film about Christianity or Christendom. I don't mean it that way. I mean it in a profound spiritual sense, because we have films about Christ that are ideological, that are about Christendom. No, I'm talking about, like the spiritual life and the arts. So, yeah.
Dr. Tsakiridou,
Mhm.
how what about the passage of time or slight imperfections in art or things or wear on art or why does that tend to make us think a work of art is more sacred, or why does it unlock some feeling of the sublime in us in a different way?
Yeah, what do you mean when you say imperfections? Like, and
I'm thinking of the work of Christopher Alexander, who's writes this pattern language for architecture, and he always has this idea that somehow the fact that the materials can wear, that they can absorb
oh,
the passage of time,
oh yes.
that it's harder for something that's perfectly plastic. I mean, in plastic in the
Yes, yes,
industrial
yes.
sense,
Oh, yes. Oh.
you
Yes, yes.
convey
No,
that.
I think I understand. Um, the it, it is I think, an expression or a form of humility when we see matter, uh, like decaying in some ways, right? When we see things being worn out, when we see a piece of clothing, that someone is wearing, for years, right? It could be, a cassock. It could be, like even a shirt or, like that a saint has been wearing, right? Or a holy person, man, woman is wearing. And we see that worn out. And I think that expression it's an expression of humility in matter, of vulnerability in matter. The materials we're using here have a certain, pretense to perfection and a pretense to endurance. And that says something about our culture, right? And whereas, like wood shows the passage of time. So many other materials that the traditional arts are using, have been using, like show the passage of time. They become they allow their bodies to be marked and wounded. Here you can find all kinds of insights, right, into the crucifixion, into the passion of Christ and human beings, into the passage of history, into the cruelties of history, which are plenty. And that becomes a conduit to human suffering, a conduit to humility. And I think it's a whole world, that these imperfections open up. And it also becomes a mirror to our own imperfections. It also allows for more depth and engagement, because we know that textured surfaces attract us more than like smooth surfaces, surfaces that are impenetrable, that are unaffected by the passage of time. And so they make us more engaged. Therefore, the materials we're using are not meant, but are such that they will make us more detached, that they will not invite us to touch, to feel. And here, we get, of course, the post-resurrection Christ, right? Where he offers his body to be touched and felt, right? So you have that sense, that we live in a world where beings, like where the things that surround us are not inviting contact.
Hmm.
They make us more isolated. They make us more alone in a way, right? They don't suggest labor, work, the passage of time, which is so important, right? In a sense, in the experience of the sacred. Everything is quick, everything is facile, everything is, like distant, because it does not invite touch, it does not invite communion. So, if you think of our material culture, it very much, reflects our isolation in some ways, our detachment, our indifference maybe. So I don't know if that's where you wanted to go.
No, that's all very good. It reminds me, as you went with that, it reminds me of something my mentor said, Jane Jacobs, the urban planner. She a lot of her writing, or maybe all of her writing, was somehow a meditation on civilization and what it's good for and what brings it down. And she thought that she was born in 1916. So she thought kind of the moment when things went south or started to go south for the United States was when the motion gears of coal-driven trains, the trains of the United States, when they put this fancy kind of wainscoting over that to hide that.
Mhm.
And she thought the moment that technology started to become this magical thing, rather than inviting people to care about how it actually works and get more engaged with the world and maybe to be inspired to solve their own problems. And instead just think, these very and then her great word was feckless, that we had become a feckless society, that people that were not really that were too superficial.
Mm.
This hunger for a contactless knowing is really drives the soul to superficiality.
Yes. I cannot speak about architecture much, although I have dear friends who are architects and have wonderful discussions with them. But this notion of not working with things, right? Not allowing the the evidence of work to show, right? Or the transformation of technology into a kind of like magical world. And it's almost a kind of worship of technology that results from that. You have this idolic dimension and so on. Again, return me to language and the way that language is also, and I'm thinking of Joseph's question about language. I think, right, Joseph? It was language and transfiguration.
That's correct.
Again, is that correct? Yeah.
That's correct.
Oh, yeah, and I'm thinking that this kind of apathy or indifference that we show toward the like things is also related to the apathy or indifference we show toward language. Language today is used in the same superficial way that Dr. Patitsas just mentioned, and it's not worked. People don't labor with it, right? They bring it in, they use it to get something done, and then they just forget all about it. By contrast, and here I'm going to come back to the Greek language, right? The Greek language is a language that has been worked, for, has been, what's the word, like, has been cultivated for years with thinking, with poetry, with theater, and so on, with political thought. And that language manifests that depth. So in order for language to have that depth, people have to work it, have to speak it, have to live it. We don't work language. We don't live language. We use it. It's a transactional relationship. So all these things come together. We may not be able to put them all together now, but I think they are coming together. They manifest the same issues, I mean, the same problem. So that's how I would go from architecture to language and what happens to language and words. And if you think of the logos, right, in all its meanings, from its designation of Christ to all the other meanings, as logos is inside things, the vital reasons of things, the logi of things, and so on. If you think of all that, the impoverishment of language is really the impoverishment of our world and of ourselves. Sorry.
Is there an exception to that? Like I've heard it said in the, several years ago um, that no other language can work in rock and roll and folk music like English. That it that there, combined with a certain kind of vulnerable expression, it can really be well worked in ways that more sophisticated languages resist. Or is that really just a complete illusion? Because every tradition has their folk, or is really what you're saying that music lyrics, when they're well done, it's a kind of poetry, and in whatever language, that's an example of well cultivated, well worked language.
I think all languages have, I mean, the capacity to be well worked, and English has its own, like potency, its own power, its own distinctive way of mapping the world, of tapping into the world, of bringing, like beings out of the world. Every language has that because every language is part of the human experience. So I'm not privileging the Greek language, except in the area of theology and philosophy, where it has such a long pedigree, right? It has such an experience, right? And also political thought as well. But all languages have the capacity to do that if they're, if someone works on them, if someone labors with them, if someone realizes that the relationship to language is a ontological relationship. It's almost, like language is a kind of cosmophony, right? It brings the world out. It pulls the world out of invisibility. And all languages do that when they are, like made to work. When someone takes language and tries to bring the world out, because that relationship matters. But when language is transactional, then that capacity that language has and that relationship with the world is missed, is not understood, and the relationship with the self as well. So I think it's not just a privilege of Greek language to do that. All languages do that because they're part of the human experience.
What's the essential core of that? Like let's say in a school system, you wanted to let's say at a fairly young age or in high school or even undergraduate, if you wanted to produce human beings, produce is not the right word, but cultivate human beings that work language intensively, what does that look like in terms of, are you asking more sacrifice from them? Are you asking more speaking from the heart? Maybe there's many things at work there.
Well, I think the speaking from the heart, and it's funny you say that because I was in Thessaloniki over, like for Christmas, and I gave a talk in a class of my colleague, Professor Iliana Zara, which was a seminar on research in the Department of Art History. And the students were presenting their papers. And the papers were okay, they were fine, they were good, but they were very detached. They were like mechanical, they were formal. There was nothing there of the person. So I asked two of the students, why did you pick this subject? And we started this conversation about that. And it ends up, the objective was to find that which moves the person and then moves the mind. So to go back to your question, if we move the person, then the mind will move. Then language will come in there so that the person whose mind was moved, right, who was moved existentially, will then use language to bring that out, to bring that personal experience out. But what you have even in Greece, right, even at the level of university research, you have research that meets all the formal conditions, but does not meet the existential condition, the condition of the heart, that connection, that it matters to the individual. Why are you writing, about such and such a place, and its architecture and its design? Well, because ultimately my family had one such house which was in ruins, and I found only this and that when I went there. That was the trigger. That was the origin. And that opens up a whole world. That's something that the students said, right? Why did I pick this subject? I picked it for this and that reason, because there was such a house that belonged to the family, and it was in ruins, and I went there. I mean, that experience, right, is something that will demand real words, right? It will bring out of language because you have to express something which is so vital to you, right? So personal, so intimate. So again, I think these things go together.
So do you think of that as a progression, that the move the person, that awakens the mind, and then language results? Is that a threefold sequence that you look for, or is that...
Yeah, for students, like, what do you love? Like, what do you love to do? What is it? Because, we say, using in some ways Platonic thought, but also Orthodox thought, is like, become who you are. Become who you are.
And what if the student
not what you want, but who you are? There's a difference between the two.
And when your student says, I love money.
That's not who you are. Yeah. I mean, of course, we're not idealists and we're not dreamers and all that. It's very concrete because you may love money, but money has nothing to do with who you are. It's a transactional thing, right? It's a thing that enables you to do X, Y, Z, and that X, Y, Z depends on who you are and what is meaningful to you. So you go back into the ground of things. And I think that's when language becomes necessary, when you find that mystery inside you. And I know that sounds maybe a little bit romantic, but let it be. When you find that mystery inside you, that you need to articulate, that you want to articulate, not that people make you articulate, but you want it because you want to bring it out. And that's a fundamental human movement. Then language will come in. But if language is policed, used transactionally, and so on, it becomes something foreign, something alien to the person who speaks it. So I think this alienation has spiritual implications as well, given logos and the incarnation in Christianity. So that is to be taken very seriously. What happens to logos in our time?
I get the impression here, now this could be controversial, and so that politically, at least in the United States, that the progressive element really specializes, they can linguistically justify anything. They're just they are the verbal masters. And the opposite element seems unwilling to engage linguistically because that will force out the nuances that blunt their desire for, I would say, clumsy action. And so somehow we're always between this Scylla and Charybdis in our political discussions. If I turn on, say, National Public Radio, it's a fantasy world, but it's so beautiful, everything that's being said. If I switch over to the president, I don't even know what that language is that he's speaking, but I sense his some raw desire to act, and somehow politics involves these people coming together and debating and forcing themselves to become intelligible to each other, and to produce some unity of the nominal and the real that actually is civilized. Sorry if I'm, insulting everyone here.
No, that is a political issue, of course, but when language becomes a kind of construct or an ideological, like an ideological construct, then it loses its fundamental function, which is to connect us to each other and to the world in which we live. So whether you are on one side or you are on the other, it doesn't really matter so much. What matters is that in all this, what is lost is the most fundamental and meaningful to human beings. Now, language is, my linguist friends tell me that it has its own kind of life. It goes in directions that mirror the way human beings live their lives and so on. You cannot really police language one way or another, right? It has that fluidity, that organismic quality about it. It's almost like a natural phenomenon, that it follows modes of life in the human sphere, right? In the human environment. And so it becomes a kind of mirror, to the world that we're creating for ourselves. I think coming from an Orthodox perspective, it's important for us to think about, what logos means in all its significances and how that relates to our own lives today. And as someone who's teaching undergraduates for many years, I notice this lack of connection to the language one speaks. It's almost that lack of connection manifests itself in truncated, fragmented speech, in speech that does not come together, that is not orchestrated by the person that speaks it. And that fragmentation of speech you can find in the political realm. Or if you find it unified, it's unified under an ideology, but it's not unified from within the person. So it doesn't have that incarnational dimension to it. Just to go back to what Joseph was asking, right, indirectly about language and the transfiguration language, in the theological sense, how can you approach language from a theological point of view? So it seems to me that this is what is happening. So what is happening at the political sphere is really on the surface. Deeper currents are determining what is happening there. Right? From either side, it doesn't really matter.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether the one has unity, which is imposed by concepts that are in some ways restricting language, and the other one has, disconnection and fragmentation because it's an attempt to blow up the unity of the other, right?
Yes, it is.
I mean, because you have that kind of struggle between two entities or two, realities that are essentially missing what is the essential.
And it really does seem like, that there's always a blood price to be paid for truth. That if what you're saying, is true on all levels, from the existential all up, it's going to involve sacrifice on your part or on the part of the people who taught you, whatever. It's not that's somehow maybe we could even call that liturgical, but we know that when Saint Porphyrios speaks, he's paid for those words. Like there's nothing in there of self-indulgence or avoidance of a cross or avoidance of a task or avoidance of aspects of the situation. There is a guy standing before you, at the end of his life, he was blind because of a medical mistake, and whatever was going on in his life, the suffering was all part of his commitment to truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that opens a kind of can of worms, this question, because it's the question of narcissism, right? Of which we have so much in our society. Narcissism is an avoidance of pain, self-love, avoidance of pain. The idea that I am an angel, really, and no matter what I do, I remain angelic. It almost has a kind of Gnostic dimension to it, right? It's a kind of cultural Gnosticism, that we have. And the person who suffers really comes into, surrenders into the being of things, right? You suffer other human beings. You suffer a hurricane or a storm. You suffer poverty, the lack of things at a given time. You suffer all this, and you're open to that. I think we're not this way. We're very much into self-love, all of us, in some way, living in a culture that rewards that in so many ways. And so, yeah, so it seems to me there's a lot to think about in this path that you're opening, that you are outlining about this. So yeah, narcissism is very much, like a what's the word? Like a significant part of the way that we live our lives today. And though we call other people narcissists, we partake of the same thing as well. All of us, because it's easy. I mean, we live in a comfort society. We like comfort, and comfort and sainthood don't go together. You cannot make Saint Porphyrioses, like with comfort. Even though the saints are comfortable in their adversity, they're comfortable in their poverty. But that's coming from a different direction. It's like the more you enter into the non-comfort zone, the more comfortable you become, the more open you are, the less vulnerable you become. I mean, it's a strange thing, right? It's a vulnerability that turns into a strength.
And is that the strength of postmodern art, that it does make people uncomfortable, or it does decenter um, a narcissistic outlook on the world? Or what?
In
I know
some ways, you
you've
would
written an
say.
entire book about this, so
Oh,
so,
yeah.
so
Well,
you have to give a short answer to that.
it depends. I will try to have a very short answer. It depends on the purpose of this disorientation. Disorientation is a good thing. Like losing the disorder in a way, undermining or in some ways deconstructing a set order of things, opens spaces that have not been experienced, makes us think, go into the unthought and the unseen and the unfelt. Yes, that's fine. But doing away with the author as genius and center of all things, right? To go to Maritain and Cocteau, because this is about Cocteau, right? The kind of narcissism that is a good thing. But there are mutations in narcissism. The narcissist may say that I am a nothing, I'm a nobody. This work is the work of my fellow men and women. It's the work, it's a significational structure in which I'm only, bringing to your attention, and I'm a nobody. But they are at the center of things. But they are still authors. But they still want, the adulation of authors and so on. So it depends on postmodernism has interesting currents in it, has interesting ideas, opens a lot of windows. But the question is what you're going to do once you open the window, right? I mean, you may open the window, but then what are you looking for?
You can usher in the demonic, I suppose, the occult, if you're not careful.
Well, you can do a lot of things. I mean, modernism can do the same thing, right? I mean, the occult modernism, yeah, sure. The same thing with the postmodern. Yeah. But I find postmodernism fascinating in the sense that, for instance, it undermines linearity, which can be like our understanding of tradition in Orthodox is often very linear, and it's often very closed. It doesn't, tradition is so, polyphonous in many ways. And we find that polyphony, if the more we look into the different types of icons that we have, right? You go into a church like a country chapel, and you see work that is like so unique, and at the same time so contemporary. It goes back, hundreds of years, and yet it can stand anywhere, anytime. It has that diachronic, transtemporal quality to it. So I think that when our understanding of tradition is linear, our thought becomes rigid. When we see the past and the present and the future intertwining and coming together in multiple dimensions, then we have a much better sense of tradition. Yeah, so I was saying about iconography, right? That a lot of our icons just repeat. They don't live. They're not in the midst of their time. They're not in, they come from the past. They transfer that past to us, but they don't have that synchronic dimension, that strong synchronic dimension that we find in the iconography of other periods at times. They don't have the mark of our time.
Can you explain the difference between logi and tropoi is in terms of aesthetics? I don't understand the latter term really, even after reading your book.
Well, I'll try, but I can put it very simply, like if all things have their vital reasons in them, right? The logoi, yeah, you can refer to them as rational principles if you want, or alternatively as vital reasons. And these vital reasons work in them, and each one, and then beings manifest that vitality, right, in different ways. So tropos has to do with the way something is. O troposou, we say in Greek. I don't like your tropos, means I don't like your manner. I don't like your behavior. I don't like the way that you're exhibiting this or that. It doesn't mean I don't like what you're saying, but I don't like the way you're delivering it. So that, has the sort of the distinctive mark of the entity of the being that is doing the act, that is, like behaving in this or that way. So it is a manifestation of the particularity of the subjectivity of something. Whereas logos is so tropoi, I think, is more on the surface, as I understand it. And I would need to go back to my book as well, because you write a book. It doesn't mean that you remember everything that you have in it, as Dr. Patitsas knows, right? The book is always ahead of you. So you got to go back to the book and learn from the book. That's the thing, right? So I would think of the tropoi as being more on the surface. At least I would begin my thinking about this. And of logoi as being more, deeper. It's a deeper level. I would think of the one as the manifestation of the other. I would think of tropoi as more subject to contingency in some ways, or to the particular circumstances of a being, because we live our lives in particular circumstances. Our bodies, are wired for that. They're wired to interact constantly with their environment, and in some ways, be affected by it, and so on. So now, how does that go transfer to aesthetics? Like the logoi and the tropoi. It's foremost the logoi, that you have like a vital reason inside the work, the image, the figure that you have created. Take a body, for instance, right? That bodies have vitality. Okay. Once alive, they have vitality. That vitality works in them. It is their, like, in a way that an artist may grasp, an iconographer may grasp, and then convey. And so that becomes important, that the work, that the figure you see, right, of a saint, the figure you see of an animal, the figure you see of a plant, has a kind of vitality to it. That relates also to Qi Yun, like the Chinese concept of spirit resonance in a work. So the logo should be at work everywhere. When we paint, there should be the logos of whatever it is that we're painting, and that should come out in a vital in the form. And some painters do that without the theory behind it, without the vocabulary behind it. They just have that gift of tapping into the vitality of things. And in Japanese and Chinese painting, it is something that has been formulated and has become a kind of artistic convention, that you tap into the vitality of things. We don't have that as strongly in iconography, but some iconographers just have it. It's a gift. You see that. Others try to simulate it or to, in a way, but it's not the same thing. I think it's a gift. I don't know if I'm answering your question though, Joseph.
I don't know. I think that was answered nicely.
About the state of iconography, I feel like genius is rare, and now that more and more people are painting icons, I think they do somewhat well to be slavish imitators until they catch on, until the spirit.
Oh, no doubt.
But I also think there's hope for bad art, because I think it can change over time, and that that somehow the prayers of the subsequent generations will also infuse the image and transform it. It can rescue it from a bad day at
churches need to be illustrated. I mean, churches need to have paintings in them, right? And people, take commissions and they paint churches and they paint chapels and so on. And that needs to be done, and that's very practical, and so on and so forth. And yes, you could say that gifted eyes and gifted hands, in the visual arts at least, are rare. Whether you call it genius or not, okay. But I'm fine with that. But some people are not. So I'm saying gifted eyes and gifted hands are, and gifted hearts are rare. And what we do is we imitate that rarity, right? That's what we do. We go back, and because we don't have them, we do what they did, right? And then, as an iconographer said to me in Greece, I imitate and I imitate and I copy and I copy and I copy the Macedonian schoolmasters, for instance, until I reach a point where I have managed to like come close to what they're doing, and then my own personal contribution will surface, which is consistent with how the Japanese and the Chinese may think about these traditional arts, where you first immerse yourself into, like replicating the masters, replicating them, and so on, until the time comes that you like blossom, that you flourish, that you surface, right? Now, granted, that is fine, is understandable. And within that tradition, also, you have distinct individuals who are capable of surfacing. Not everybody will surface. So these people that will surface in a traditional art, of course, in a traditional art, you do that. Of course, I'm not talking about someone painting icons out of nowhere, right? Out of his or her own mind. No. But once you paint, there are icons out there that have such power in them. And they are, that you just stand in front of them and no time has passed. Nothing, they're here. They almost have the presence of persons, like they encounter you like an event. They're not art, they're not icon, they're not, like a fresco. They are an event that is taking place right before you. And that is part of what I've tried to do with my work, to say that the time, like we speak about icons, iconology and all that. No, it is that. It is an event. When an icon happens in that way, it is an event. And it brings with it, like a sort of spiritual intensity and a kind of incarnational dynamic that makes you think then of other, of spiritual realities in aesthetic terms. It's because of these works that, we write what we write, right? I mean, it's because of them. It's because they exist. And it's like Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. It's an event. It's not art. It's a happening. It's a reality that has been created. Do you see? And I would rather have fewer images and have this kind of image than have tons of them. And I would rather have only one such icon in my home than have 100 that are made with paper and digital technology, even though I understand that the people who make them need to make a living in this way or that. Maybe it's too, I don't know.
No, I was just wondering if what you're describing is the kind of alignment of tropos and logos. That tropos is the event, and it really has lined up with the logos of what? Because not every icon of Christ, shows the identical face. It's
no,
not like, but somehow the logos of that icon, if we can speak in such terms, because that probably isn't how Maximus would.
No, it doesn't matter, but we can take it and use it in that context with the understanding that he may have questions.
This work of art has so fulfilled its purpose. It's so charged now. Yes.
It's an event. It's like in the icon that I have on the cover of the last book on postmodernism. My good friend, the iconographer and theologian Uresis Todorovic, who's now in China teaching at the University of Macau. When we were discussing the cover, he said, "Why are you putting, like a early 16th century icon in a book that is, on the cover of a book that is about postmodernism?" Right? He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know why I'm doing it, but I'm doing it because that's a sort of transtemporal image. That's a diachronic image. Because in that image, Christ, the way that the tropos, right, if you want, the way that Christ stands, like with one hand touching the hand of the, like possessed man, of the demoniac, and with the other listening to him. It's so potent. It's like so present that, yeah, I mean, it just breaks even the concept of art, right? It breaks the concept of the icon. It does. You don't need all these things. You don't need. It's a kind of it's like a transfiguration of art, right? It loses its materiality, it loses its artificiality, it loses all the categories that art historians use, and we have too much of art history in our understanding of the icon. Too much of that, right? So we need it, but there's more to the icon in such moments, and it breaks out of all these categories, and that's a kind of postmodern moment in a way. It breaks out. It says, I don't need. I'm beyond that. I'm not even there. Categories don't touch me, right? But that happens, as you said before, rarely.
Alan Bloom, the political philosopher at University of Chicago, he said something similar about a novel called Journey to the End of the Night.
I haven't read that.
It's
but yeah.
he just thought it had escaped the bounds of what could be sort of critiqued.
Yeah.
I didn't like the novel. I of course after that I went and read it.
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
But I was more impressed by the comment, than
Yeah, but I understand what he's saying, right? That well, here's another thing. There are some times when you encounter a work, wherever that is, right? It could be a photograph, it could be a film, it could be an icon. You encounter a work and you don't want to say anything afterwards. You fall into a kind of silence, right? A kind of ontological silence where you think that language, whatever you say at that moment, cannot capture what you encountered. And I think, for me at least, in connection with that work in Castoria, that has been going on for years. Like I've been to that place, to Mavriotissa, the chapel of St. John the Theologian, where the work is, so many times. Every time I go there, I have a proskinema in front of that image. I'm reduced to silence. And then I write about it, but I'm still reduced to silence. And I know that what I write is inadequate. So it's like St. Simeon, the new theologian, when he writes his poetry, he writes incessantly. He writes and writes and writes and writes and writes. And he writes because he cannot put it in words. That's why you write. Because underneath that writing is a silence that you experience, a profound silence. That it just stops you from whatever you're doing and says, here I am. Right? Here I am. And it is the Christ who's here in that icon, in that fresco, right? And it is the demoniac who's there. And it is the disciples who are there. But Christ leads the way in that, intense presence. That is, what can you say about this? Nothing. Even iconology. I mean, iconology, you don't even want to use that word. Do you see?
It reminds me a little bit of a very narcissistic period in my life, when I was a baby. And you see many images, but when you see the mother, and this is a different the rest of what you've seen, the many faces that you've seen, in other words, are passed over for that. Except because I'm coming to that as a narcissist. Well, also as just a needful baby, I immediately address a lot of demands to the mother. Whereas in the case of these icons, you do not. The ontological silence is more fulfilled. It's everything else was an image. This is reality, and it's an all-encompassing reality.
It is a reality, but it just happens to be, yeah. So it is that kind of reality that art brings, and that always reminds me of I think it was Zeffirelli who said that about, totally different, right? In a secular example, but they help. I think it was Zeffirelli who said that about Maria Callas, that when he saw her enter the stage, like enter, and when she appeared in a certain way, in a certain role, I think it was La Traviata, he felt like his heart leapt, he felt this, like he had this in-depth experience, which is something when you're left speechless because you see something in front of you that is a manifestation, it's a reality. It's not a woman pretending to be this, it's not theater, it's not opera, but it is the person walking there is the thing, right? Is that. So it's almost like a kind of resurrection of being, right, in a person. It's the resurrection of being on a wall in a fresco. And that potency, that art has to bring that out of nowhere, right? On a wall, in Castoria, in a 16th century, like fresco that has been affected by time, that shows all, like the wounds of time, and yet, remains there in its, again, as I said, it's a form of resurrection. It's almost like Christ showing his wounds, but he's there. He's there. He's long gone, but he's there. I mean, that sense, right? That they're from 1522, but they're here. And I think this then goes to this kind of experience we don't make possible in the way we live our lives, I think, and sometimes even in the way we teach. So I don't know. Joseph, I don't know if you have like there other points, other questions that you had, and
That felt so. There is one more question I want to ask, but it almost feels like, there's it would introduce levity or something. Even though it's I think an interesting question. Maybe I'll ask it and we can try it out. I'm curious about this Chinese idea of when. I had written a paper in my early undergraduate about this in relationship to the notion of logos as they pertain to aesthetics. Um, but I was also curious when Dr. Patitsas was talking about Christopher Alexander's kind of his work. He has the idea of the quality without a name. And it seemed to me like maybe the idea of when is sort of capturing that quality without a name. So maybe Dr. Patitsas, you could talk a little bit about that idea of Alexander's, and then Dr. Tsakiridou, if you could talk about the idea of when, if you see it as similar or differing in any way. Um, I was reading an essay right before we started this, dealing with the idea of when, and it said that in contemporary Chinese, the word for culture is derived from the notion of making, what is it? Making all under heaven. Yeah, transform all under heaven. So to me, I thought that was kind of bound up with this notion of art as bringing logi into their own fulfillment, things into their own being, people becoming what they are. So this is a nexus of ideas, but if we want to play with that a little bit.
Well, yes, in The Timeless Way of Building, Christopher Alexander begins with this description of the quality without a name, and he says that it's the search of your life is the search for an encounter with this quality, and which we find in art or in a building or in a situation. And he says that the reason why we use so many words to describe it is because it's too precise for language. That is meant the more synonyms or the more we try to sort of form an overlapping circle of it's a little bit like this, a little bit like that, the more it's still eludes a precise name, and therefore it's the quality without a name. Yeah, that's all I will say about that for now, I guess. Just that I think what I like about his book, what I like about The Timeless Way of Building, is that by starting with this quality which eludes language, which invites language but still eludes it, you bring the students or the reader to a different place in their mind, and that prepares them for the rest of the discussion in the book. And so it's like a very almost automatic moment of repentance or spiritual awakening that he confides in the reader, with such predictable, such regularity. Every time you read it, you return to it, you know what he's talking about, and you have to admit that you know things that you cannot describe, and that begins to liberate you from what education has done to you. And I sometimes connect this quality to something that my mentor and my dissertation director, Robin Darling Young, told me, that anointing is always dual, that the anointed is always marked for sovereignty and is marked to be sacrificed. And the ability to sustain that duality, to combine it through thanksgiving or through spiritual sobriety or through adventure, whatever it is kind of the purpose of it's the course of your spiritual life, is to keep the two poles of anointing united in yourself. And then in that sense, the acquisition of the Holy Spirit is the purpose of the Christian life, because you become a stably anointed person. So I think that trying to create art, we add and we subtract as we write or compose music, until we reach that quality as close as we can for that thing. And then I think it's very personal whether someone else might see that in us. I assume the greater talent we are, the more people will see that. Although there's probably some kind of an inflection point. There are certain works of art that most people might miss, but some people will get exactly what's being said. Well, I think I just talked in a big circle here, so I'll stop. Yeah, but those are some thoughts.
Well, I don't have much to say, Joseph, about when, because I really don't know much about it. So I try to look into it a bit, but again, when you look into something that you really don't know much about, you don't know where to look exactly. So I wish I had, if you told me that you wrote a paper, I would have loved to look at the paper and then, be able to comment. But I don't have the concept, so I cannot really speak to the concept and what it means, in the way that it is used in the Chinese, like writings, whether they are philosophy or they're political philosophy or an understanding of how society works. So if you want to give me some kind of variation on that or some interpretation of that, then I could address it from the standpoint of the work that I have done.
I mean, insofar as I understand it, I think kind of the distinction between logi and tropoi is sort of the similar, like when is the way Tao is in the world or something. Especially,
So the Tao is the logos, you mean, and the
yeah.
when it's tropos of manifestation.
Okay. Well, unless there's anything that's still smoking for either of you, we can call it there.
I need to get on to another meeting, so I have to
Perfect. Okay.
let it go
So
here.
That's
we're
providential.
fine.
Okay, this
We're
was
fine.
very lovely, both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Dr. Patitsas. Thank
Dr.
you.
Tsakiridou, thank you. It's always nice to hear the voice of Thessaloniki.
Oh,
and
now
the presence of Saint Demetrius and of
yes,
Saint Anicia. Saint
I
Anicia.
grew up like 2 buildings from it. I was just in the next square. That's where I grew up.
Wow.
So that's my church in many ways, and continues to be. I love it. I don't live there anymore. I mean, we don't live there anymore, but yeah, but it is the place.
I heard this past October, October of 2024, that the Saint Demetrius events were unusually miraculous and spirit-filled. And
Mhm.
I arrived about a week later, and it was still long lines to
Yes.
get there. So, and it was, and the air was charged. I had heard this, but it also felt it.
Yeah, not only in the big events, but just ordinary things. I go there on Saturdays for the liturgy, and I hadn't been there in a number of years. And then my colleague, Professor Zara, who goes there regularly, she said, "Why don't you come to St. Demetrius once?" I said, "Well, we live in Panorama. You know where that is, right? From Panorama to St. Demetrius, it's a bit of a distance, right?" So, but I remember that the first time that I walked in, it was just like that. Just, it was, oh, oh, there is, like, okay, we have to be cautious about that because we are in philosophy and we are rationalists of sorts, right? But when you walk in there, you know that you're there. Let's put it this way. That you know that the place has a life of its own. And that's the thing. And then there's always that light. It has a certain kind of light in there. Yeah. It's yeah.
Well,
So
I must go. So I wish you both
yeah,
until we
Okay.
meet again.
wonderful. Yeah, well, all good things. Thank you very much. And it was really a pleasure. Just wonderful. And
Thank
maybe
you.
we can do.
That would
Thank you
be
very much
wonderful.
for
Quite the
the
blessing.
initiative. Thank you.
Okay.
Take
Take
care.
care, both of you.